Welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin and I'm joined by the world famous, in Uddingston at least, Mr. Michael Whitehouse. How the heck are you, Mike?
Population of 3,000 people, everyone. Actually, I don't know what the population of Uddingston is. I'm fine. How are you all doing? I mean, how are you doing? For a second I thought our audience could answer me.
Every one of me's feeling great. As you know, we've been working on a special piece of Patreon content, so this morning I've been doing a bit of editing for that. That's video editing, everyone. Moving pictures, talkies.
You get to see my fat face.
I am hoping to get that up, the video, not Mike's face, for the Patreon members tonight, if possible. Tonight as we record this, so it'll be up before this episode goes out. It's been kind of a secret-ish thing because I didn't want to promote it and then it fell through. We do enough of that, I think.
Yeah.
So
experts of that. I'm an expert of that. It's mostly my fault. I announce things. We're doing this, and then it doesn't happen.
Well, I think now you can go and do what I know you've been itching to do, and if you like, you can tell our listeners what that video, hopefully the first in a series, actually is.
It was a hot tub adventure.
Yes.
So we went to the landing site of the spiky balls incident.
Yeah, Robert Taylor. It was good.
I just like calling it the spiky ball incident. So a previous episode we did, one of Martin's episodes, was about the alleged landing of a UFO or something akin to that in this area, and it was great. Got to walk through some woods and go looking for spooky things with Martin and Callum, who some of you will know from the stuff we do on Ghastly Tales.
Yeah, it was good. It was good to actually be physically there in the location and get a real feel for it, and then to be able to look at some of the footage that was shot immediately after the Robert Taylor incident and see how the area had changed. All the trees and everything had grown up, but you could see certain details. There's like an old stone wall, an old crumbled stone wall that you can see in that early footage, and it's still there, except now it's going through a really dense forest instead of being out in the open. It's just kind of cool to see it all and to be there in the location and be able to share that with people. So yeah. Speaking of Patreon, looks like we have 3 new patrons since we last recorded.
Excellent.
Yep. I need to say a hello and a genuine heartfelt thank you to Tyler Horton, Jake Moen, or Moan, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. They are our new Nightbirds. And to Susie Q, who joined us at our highest Dawn Star level. Your contributions are all really important to the show and we deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to support us and get access to a range of special bonus content into the bargain, including the video that we were just talking about, you can do so at patreon.com/talking till dawn.
Yep, and we're working on some bonus episodes and things like that, and they're more casual than the stuff that we do on the main show, but they're a lot of fun, and I think people are getting a good kick out of them.
Yeah, we've got a lot more ideas for stuff we're going to do on there, so watch this space. But now, a quick word of warning before we get into the main content of tonight's episode. We're going to be discussing some very cruel and shocking crimes in the course of looking at this topic, including brutal murders, sex crimes, and crimes against children. The World's End Murders is an infamous double murder that took place in Edinburgh, and it hooks into a much bigger picture involving a serial killer and rapist who essentially devoted his life to a horrible range of awful crimes. It will not be one of our more light-hearted episodes. It won't be suitable for all listeners. If any of the topics that I've just mentioned are likely to be unduly distressing to you, you may wish to give this episode a miss, and we'll see you back here when we're talking about something less grim.
I can't remember if we've said this before, but on our episodes where we are talking about things that are quite disturbing like this, not just quite disturbing, but very disturbing, there's no shame in switching off if it's something that is going to affect your mental health. I do that with certain things. I can get into a true crime documentary and sometimes I need to step away from it because it does affect me. So I just wanted to say, if anyone's listening who feels that way and feels, like they're second guessing themselves about that sort of thing, like, it's totally fine to just, look after yourself. Try not to let these things consume you.
Yeah, definitely. That out of the way, I think we should get into it.
That out of the way, here's all the terrible stuff that'll keep you awake tonight.
So it's the evening of the 15th of October 1977. It's a Saturday night, and 17-year-olds Helen Scott and Christine Eadie are getting ready for a big night out on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh's Old Town. Helen and Christine were close friends, not BFFs, but good friends. Both were core kind of members of a tight-knit group of friends who were meeting for drinks in town that night. Most of whom had known each other since their first year at Firhill High School in Oxgangs, about 5 years prior to the events of this night. By this point, October 1977, both Helen and Christine had left school and were working full-time. In Scotland, then as now, the school leaving age is between 15 and 18, depending on whether you stay on at school for your higher exams, which most students planning to go to university will do, or whether you leave to go straight into a job or vocational college or whatever, in which case you can leave in the year of your 16th birthday, usually after setting your O grades, as they were then called. Both Helen and Christine had chosen the latter, so although they were only 17, they had both been out in the adult world of work for about a year. Christine Eadie had worked for the local council for a while before taking up an office admin position at a surveying company. Despite being an early school leaver, she was an intelligent, life-loving, popular, hard-working young woman with, and almost every source on the subject makes a point of mentioning this, a gregarious, outgoing, confident personality. Christine's primary caregiver growing up was her grandmother. There's some suggestion of minor difficulties growing up. I'm not sure exactly what. There's very little information in the public realm about Christine Eadie's life. In the wake of what would transpire later on the evening in question, quite understandably as we'll see, Christine's family would ask the press for privacy. They chose to keep a fairly low profile, and by and large that was respected. But whatever troubles she may have experienced growing up, she doesn't seem to have been letting those hold her back. She seems to have been a young woman making the most of her youth, with good prospects ahead of her and everything going for her. Helen Scott at this time was working in a kilt shop, of all things, on Princes Street, which is about the most Edinburgh job I can think of, Michael.
Yeah, other than selling shortbread.
Yeah, she was living at her parents' home on Swan Spring Avenue in the Comiston area of the city, and she was staying there while she worked at building up some savings, and she was toying with the idea of going to technical college to get her hires, perhaps ultimately to go on to university to study childcare. It's a pretty standard situation for someone her age, like 1 foot in adulthood, but not really ready to commit to any particular path. I don't think many of us truly know what we want to do with our lives at that age.
Any age.
Christ, I mean, I'm still not sure what I want to be when I grow up and I'm in my late 30s. I'm sure she would have gone on to have an amazing life. They both would have. So anyway, this evening, about 7 p.m, a little after sunset, the October sky is deepening towards darkness as the city begins to glow and come to life. Helen rides the bus into town and meets a friend of hers, Jackie Inglis, outside Jenner's department store on Princes Street. The pair grabbed a quick drink at the Mount Royal Hotel before crossing the Waverley Bridge and heading on to meet two more of their friends, Tony Kivlin and Christine Eadie, at the Wee Windies pub on the Royal Mile. Tony Kivlin is a little older than the other girls. She's closer to 20. The others are all 17 or thereabouts. Now, I should say that although the legal age for alcohol sales in Scotland is 18, especially in the 1970s, that wasn't always particularly strongly enforced. That might seem strange to folk who live in places where the drinking age is like 21 or whatever. I think it's harder to get away with now, but that 18-year-old limit wasn't, it hasn't always been treated as a hard cut-off, shall we say.
Yeah.
In the 70s and 80s, even to some extent in the very early 2000s, when I was 16, 17, there were well-known pubs in Ayr that would turn a blind eye to underagers like me and wouldn't really hassle you for ID as long as you kinda looked like you could handle your booze. If you're polite, you didn't cause any trouble. In turn, the police would kinda turn a blind eye to these places breaking the law by selling drink to underagers. I suppose in part because it kept a lot of the underage drinking in places where they could somewhat keep an eye on it, rather than like in the park or in an underpass somewhere.
Not that I want to interject with a jovial story, but when I was at school, there was a night out organised by the prefect. The people who were, it's like class president type of thing. And they organised it and they booked it at, as many people know, I grew up in a place called Kings Park. You'll also know a lot about that if you listen to one of the Patreon episodes. And they booked a night at the Kings Park Hotel, which I hope no one minds me saying this, but it's a bit dingy. Well, on the outside, it's a bit dingy, but
it's got a good heart. It's got a good heart, Michael.
Yeah, we were 15 and we were booked in as first year university medical students. And I, at that age, at 15, had very little experience of drinking. And I got so drunk, this is the... I mean, all the staff were looking at us, and I remember there was a girl who was there who I knew at school, and she was about 4 foot tall, and she looked about 12, even though she was about 15. And they're serving everyone, I mean, pints after pints after pints, and it was hilarious. And
that's amazing.
It turned into absolute bedlam.
It illustrates what I'm trying to say. Like, Scotland is one of those places that very much has a hard drinking culture.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite to the extremes of the Russians or the Finns, but more than most countries, I think. I think the attitude's almost like, these are the alcohol training wheels, letting you drink in a sort of relatively civilized pub versus always going to some dodgy flat party or like a derelict place. That might be the difference between you growing up to become like a weekend pub binge drinker and becoming like a 24-hour alky living under a bridge, you know?
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, whether that really does work or not, I don't know. But that is or was the common consensus here, I think. The four of them are drinking. They're drifting from pub to pub. They're not quite shit-faced, but they're having a good time. So it's busy, it's bustling. There's a good atmosphere, people of all ages coming and going. For those of you not familiar with Edinburgh, the Royal Mile is the informal name for a succession of streets passing through the city's old town. The streets forming the Royal Mile, Castle Hill, Lawn Market, High Street, Canongate and the Abbey Strand, are those connecting Edinburgh Castle in the west with Holyrood Palace and the Scottish Parliament building to the east. And as the name suggests, the route is about 1 mile in length. This road is lined with towering 17th and 18th century buildings. It's absolutely rammed with pubs, bars, cafes, restaurants, hotels. So
beautiful at Christmas time.
Yeah. So they're having a good night. Of course, these are teenagers, so there's some requisite low-level drama that I think any of us who've been youngsters can relate to. I know you can, because you've just given me some examples of that, Michael. But, you know, so Helen and Christine had like a short-lived falling out over some silly joke that got a bit out of hand, but they reconciled. Tony got freaked out when Helen had a slight nosebleed. Just teenager stuff, you know. They weren't bad kids, they were just kids. Eventually, the group ended up, some might say ominously, in a pub called the World's End. This is an old-fashioned drinking establishment, a place that to this day still exists largely unchanged from the 1970s. Actually, it's a place that takes its name from another dark episode in Edinburgh's history. Following the Battle of Flodden in 1513, which incidentally took place right next to Helen's childhood home, King James IV was killed in battle against the English army along with a large chunk of Scotland's nobility, the country's ruling class essentially. The nation was left in a bit of a shambles. Lawlessness was rife, and the threat of invasion and war loomed large. In response to all this, fortified defences were built around what is now the Old Town and Castle areas, converting Edinburgh into a walled city. The edge of the urban area at that time was roughly where the Canongate begins today, and a gate in the wall stood just outside of where the World's End pub is now situated. The gates entering in and out of the city and most of the walls are now long gone, but you can still see brass cobbles in the road outside the World's End pub, which mark the exact location of where the old gates once stood. City dwellers of the 16th century had little reason to venture past those and out into the dangers of the outside world, so to your ordinary run-of-the-mill Edinburgher of the time, just trying to make ends meet inside the relative safety of the city, those gates were, figuratively speaking, the World's End, their World's End. So that's how the pub got its name.
That's fascinating, I didn't know that.
But after this night's events, that name would take on an even more sinister association, I think. to this day, I think when people in Scotland hear the World's End pub, they're not usually thinking of old defensive walls. The night was well underway by the time the young women hit the World's End. Witnesses described them taking turns on the payphone at the end of the bar, phoning friends and ringing up old acquaintances. This was decades before the smartphone, before posing with your pints for Instagram was a thing, but it just goes to show, I think, that like drunk dialing and making sure everyone knows what a good time you're having, perhaps not the recent inventions we tend to think of them as. Meanwhile, other people were joining the group, other friends, people who knew them from school or pals of pals. So you're talking about a loose, semi-regular group of people who tended to have known each other since childhood and happened to frequent the same bars in the city centre. So although, yes, these girls are drinking underage, there's little else about this that seems to portend any kind of danger. They're in an extremely busy public place. They're surrounded by friendly and familiar faces, and by and large, everyone is having a good time and enjoying one another's company. But at a certain point, Tony and Jacqueline went to the toilet together, and when they came back, they found Christine and Helen deep in conversation with two unknown men. Both men appeared to be in their late 20s or early 30s, a good 10 to 15 years older than Helen and Christine. But still, there wasn't anything happening with them that particularly struck any of the witnesses as sinister or inappropriate, or even particularly worthy of a second look. These kinds of old school British pubs are famously the sort of place where you'd get people of different walks of life, different generations, just mingling and talking to each other. I'd go into old Glasgow pubs with my friends when I was an 18-year-old student, and we'd end up talking to like old retired shipyard workers or whatever. They're just that kind of place.
Yeah.
So if no one was being actively, openly sleazy or handsy or whatever, most people wouldn't look twice at that. Even more so in the 70s, but even today, I think in a place like the World's End Bar. Jackie would later describe one of the men as being shorter and stockier with a round face and strikingly dark brown eyes. The other was slightly taller and slimmer built. Both men wore the flares, V-neck jumpers and long collared shirts that were the fashion at the time. There was nothing about them that stood out from anyone else in the pub, and therefore there was little reason for Jackie at the time to really scrutinise them. Before they could rejoin Helen, Christine and the two men now at their table, Jackie and Tony fell into conversation with some other friends at the bar. Word was circulating around among the friends and friends of friends at the bar of a house party taking place elsewhere in the city. Jackie and Tony were invited and agreed to go. Before leaving, Jackie asked Helen and Christine if they wanted to come too. They were invited to the party, but Christine declined, deciding to stay there in the World's End, and Helen seemed so deeply engrossed in conversation with the two men, she didn't even turn to acknowledge the question. Okay, well, fine. There's two of them. They've got each other. No one's been left alone. So Jackie and Tony and the other friends and acquaintances that had been in the pub all left, leaving Helen and Christine together in the company of these two unknown males. And that would be the last time any of the friends would see Helen or Christine alive. The next morning, about 10:30, Jackie was awoken by the ringing of a telephone. She, of course, had made it home safely in a taxi sometime in the early hours after leaving the house party she'd gone to with Tony and the other friends. But now it's the Sunday morning, she's coming off the back of a heavy night. I think it's safe to assume she's probably not feeling her best at this point, but this day is about to get worse than she could ever have imagined. On the other end of the phone is Maurian Scott, Helen's father. He's asking if Helen had slept over at hers, at Jackie's. The previous night, Helen's mother, Margaret, had waited up for her daughter arriving home. Classic mum move right there, by the way. I'm sure we've all been tiptoeing into the house half cut, trying your absolute best not to knock anything over. And it's like, what time do you call this? That old classic. But unfortunately, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say at this point, heartbreakingly, Margaret waited and Helen never came home. No one's panicking at this stage though. There's concern, yep, but not alarm bells. This is pre-mobile phone, pre-social media. Some people didn't even have home phones in the 70s. So people were out of contact sometimes. We talked about this before, but that was just a fact of the world then.
Yeah.
Teenagers especially, you know, someone meets someone, goes off with someone, just gets even just blutered and crashes out on the living room floor of some dingy student flat somewhere. They'd be incommunicado until they physically got themselves either home or to a phone box or whatever. So it's not an emergency right away, but an unease is growing. Jackie heads over to Christine's flat, thinking probably Helen had gone back and stayed there because Helen and Christine had been left together. But there was no one home. No sign of Helen, and no sign of Christine either. Jackie phoned around all their mutual friends. No one had seen or heard from either of the young women since the world's end. Later that day, Jackie Inglis, Margaret and Maureen Scott, Tony Kivlin and a number of other friends and family of the missing girls convened in another pub not far from the world's end to discuss what they should do. Concern was now turning to outright fear, I think, as more people chipped in with information, or lack of information. More people essentially confirming that they had not heard or seen anything of the girls since the World's End pub. One after another, the common sense, everyday explanations for the girls' absence that they'd maybe been comforting themselves with started to melt away. The decision was made at this point to contact the police. Jackie Inglis and Helen's parents had not long left the police station, having officially reported Helen and Christine missing. This is really awful, Michael. When they heard a news report on the radio that the brutally murdered bodies of two young women had just been discovered.
Oh, God.
Imagine finding out that way.
That's horrendous.
Imagine that.
That's horrendous. The image of waiting up for your child to return home's bad enough, but finding out that way.
Yeah.
And I know that I've read a few cases in the past where, especially in like the 70s, where that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
People found out about someone being murdered because it was all of a sudden reported in the radio. Or...
I mean, I expect it still happens today when it's an unknown victim. These women weren't named on the radio because they didn't have their identities at that time, but, you know, putting two and two together, it's hard to come up with another explanation for...
It's the fact that there's two of them as well.
Two of them, yeah, and the circumstances around it. Sunday the 16th was a sunny, unseasonably pleasant day for October in the southeast of Scotland. That morning, day trippers Ruth and Derek Taylor made the 15-mile drive east out of Edinburgh to Seaton Sands for an autumn picnic and a walk along the coast. This is a stunning stretch of coastline. There's grassy dunes, sandy beaches, wetlands. There's a nature reserve not far from there along the coast at Aberlady, various sites of special scientific interest. It looks out onto the Firth of Forth. You know, you can watch the distant shipping coming into Grangemouth and Rosyth, while the water just offshore sometimes is like bouncing with dolphins. There's curlews teeming on the mudflats. Last time I was there was this massive barn owl just like lazily swooping back and forth next to one of the main paths in the middle of the daytime. Yeah, I love it there. I do recommend it. Don't let this put you off. But Derek and Ruth, they walk along the coast a little way. They walk for about 30 minutes from the car park at Seaton Sands, round the small headland at Long Nidri Bents, enjoying the sun, looking out into the Forth. They pass the tank traps, regimented lines of huge concrete cubes placed at the high tide line during the Second World War to defend against the threat of a Nazi invasion from the North Sea. Still there, crumbling a bit now, crusted with algae, but still standing. And they come around past these into the next bay, Gosford Bay. It's a quieter stretch of sand than Long Nidri. Gosford Bay is overlooked by Gosford House, a huge stately home built in the 1790s, designed by neoclassical architect Robert Adam for the 7th Earl of Wemyss and March, and still owned by one of his descendants today, actually. It's a striking building, all stone steps and pillars and colonnades and whatnot. I think they used it, was it Outlander? I think they used it for filming some of Outlander, so you may have seen it in that.
I've not watched Outlander, but you're talking to other people, aren't you?
Yeah, I've not seen it either, but apparently it was used in Outlander. It was just opposite Gosford House, where the couple noticed an unusual object lying at the high tide line. From a distance, Derek Taylor thought it looked like a store mannequin that had been dumped or washed up on the sands. He approached it out of curiosity and soon realised that this was no store dummy. It was the body of a young woman, lying on her back, naked but for a makeshift gag stuffed into her mouth. She'd been strangled to death. Derek and Ruth Taylor turned heel and ran. They dialed 999 from the Gosford House caretaker's lodge. Christine Eadie, who just hours before had been brimming with joy and excitement, with love for her friends, with hope for the future, now just discarded remains, dead eyes left staring up into a clear blue sky. It's just such a wrenchingly tragic and hideous thing.
Yeah.
A few hours later, and about 2 miles southeast and inland from Gosford Bay, a gardener named John Mackenzie was walking his dog on a path near Coates Farm. In Scotland, in October, the nights are drawing in sharply, the evening gloom is setting in, and in the thickening shadows of a harvested barley field, he almost misses it. The strange, out-of-place object lying among the crop stubble. The object he initially mistakes for a, sing it with me Michael, a shop mannequin. If you read much into true crime, you soon find that people mistaking dead bodies for tailor's dummies are probably one of the most common repeating elements in murder investigations. I think when we happen upon like a real life horror in actual reality, it's not like a movie where there's ominous music building you up to it. There's no eerie build up. The universe just sort of plops the most unspeakable things in your path to the point where there's almost like a mismatch between how horrifying the thing is, in this case a murdered teenager, and how ordinary and mundane the sort of context in the situation is, you know.
It's kind of like, I mean, I found a dead body and it's like, it's terrible to say this, you kind of get protected in a way from it because you might not have the shock that you actually think initially, because it is as if you have this derealization moment from it where you're just kind of like, you can't really take in what it is you're looking at, you know.
I think that's exactly it. And I think even more than that, it's like the surrounding context of it like doesn't lead you to expect it, so if you're not prepared for it, then it doesn't really hit you as hard in a way. Like if it's just an ordinary dog walk on an ordinary evening in an ordinary field, the birds are singing, the world's going on as normal, I mean, I guess it almost feels like it can't be a body. It has to be some mundane object, like a dummy, because it's such an ordinary situation.
Yeah. I should say that when I nonchalantly said I've found a dead body, I don't mean in that sort of circumstance. I just mean that, you know, I've went into a room and found someone dead. So, you know, I just mean that even in that circumstance, when I kind of knew what I was going into, kind of knew, the shock of being outside and just, it's something you think about when you're out hiking. Well, I don't know, I think about it. I love the outdoors, you love the outdoors as well, Martin. But I find something, if I'm on my own, I find something kind of ominous about it as well. And sometimes if you're in certain stretches of coast or empty forest paths, sometimes you do think, like, what am I going to find here? Yeah. You know, it's kind of there.
I mean, there probably are, there's thousands of years of human history all around you. Yeah. You're quite close to dead bodies more often than you think. You know, maybe not always murdered in recent times, but yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it is people build their expectations for how they will respond from the closest comparison they have, which tends to be like television and movies and things like that, where there's a build-up, there's music, or there's the cinematography leads you to expect it, so there's a build-up of tension, and actually in reality there's no build-up of tension before it happens, it just happens.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it, and then the other part of it, as you say, it's almost like a moment of derealization because you're outside of your normal experience, so you've not really learned a response to something like that because it's so unusual for an ordinary person to happen upon it. But so anyway, listeners, you don't need me to tell you that sadly this was no mannequin. Helen was clad only in a black coat, Christine's coat, and her hands had been tightly bound behind her back. John Mackenzie, like David and Ruth Taylor before him, ran as fast as his legs would comply to report what he'd found to the local police. The murders of the two young women attracted a huge tornado of media attention. There was debate, there was leering tabloid hysteria. In the midst of all this, Detective Superintendent George McPherson found himself in charge of what would prove to be a complex and sprawling police investigation. In fact, it was sort of two police operations. The crimes that had taken place had unfolded across the purview of two very different divisions of Lothian and Borders Police's jurisdiction. The City Division, encompassing the city of Edinburgh, where the girls were last seen alive and from where they were likely taken. Very much a hardened urban police force, used to dealing with murders, violent crimes, and the much more rural East Lothian Division, which encompassed both the field where Helen was discovered and the beach where Christine was found. And a force with perhaps less experience in this area of policing, but arguably with a feeling of something to prove maybe against their bigger urban neighbour. So each of these two operations were headed by a separate Detective Chief Inspector from the respective divisions of the force, both nominally working hand in hand and reporting to DS McPherson. But in later years, there would be questions asked about whether tensions, bureaucracy and territoriality hindered the effectiveness of the investigation, because these departments both felt that they had something to prove to the other one, essentially, and maybe didn't work as closely as they could have done. Lothian and Borders Police itself had only been formed about 2 years prior from a number of smaller independent police forces all amalgamating together. Not every senior copper was happy with this arrangement. In fact, I think it's quite likely that many were not. In these kinds of reorganisations, there are always a lot of little empires being disrupted, a lot of rivalries, agendas, and axes being ground. I get the sense that there's definitely innuendo in several of the sources I've looked at that suggests to me the working relationship in this case was not always as smooth or as close as it could have been or should have been because of this. The Rural Division was nominally in charge of the overall case. This is because the bodies were discovered on their territory. However, it soon becomes apparent there's a complete lack of witnesses coming forward in that arm of the investigation. No one, at this stage, seems to have seen the vehicle presumably involved in dumping the bodies. There were very few reliable reports, even of any strangers hanging around. They have the bodies, they have gags and ligatures, they have Catherine's coat, and this kind of potential forensic evidence. But even for that, they're reliant on the facilities and forensic labs of the larger, dominant City Division. The City Divisions, meanwhile, have an almost unmanageable volume of potential witnesses, from Helen and Christine's friends, the staff at the World's End bar, the hundreds of patrons at the pub, the thousands of diners and drinkers and tourists and cabbies and everyone else who had been milling around on the Royal Mile that night and might have seen them leave. This is a busy place. No doubt many people saw them leave the pub, and where they went and who with, they're probably just not aware of the significance of what they've seen. The main lead they're looking at, of course, is these two men Helen and Christine were last seen talking to. But you have to remember, to the police in 1977, without the benefit of hindsight, they're right down in the weeds of this case. They're not being presented with like a curated narrative like I'm giving you, right? I'm taking relevant details and highlighting them. I'm glossing over the irrelevant details. I'm trying to build a coherent story out of all this for the listeners. All they have, though, is this huge mountain of unanswered questions and possibilities and uncertainties. So it's not even immediately clear if those two men at the pub actually had anything to do with this. It's entirely possible at this stage in the investigation that Helen and Christine left those guys and went somewhere else, or they went to another place with those guys and met someone else, or they've left and then bumped into some maniac on the way home. There's really an unlimited range of possibilities still at this stage. These two men were of interest, obviously, but I just wanted to point out that things weren't as clear-cut as they might seem to us looking back.
Yeah, it's kind of, they have this sort of white noise that they've got to pick through, and after the fact, like you say, it's easier to piece together a narrative.
Definitely. I'm piecing together this narrative with the benefit of hindsight, with the knowledge of how things came out. But one thing that did immediately point towards there being two perpetrators involved is the very fact that there were 2 victims. It would not be an easy feat for one single man to abduct, bind, gag, rape, and murder 2 feisty adult or near enough adult women simultaneously. Not saying it's never been done, because it has happened, unfortunately, and I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible in this case, especially if the perpetrator had the threat of maybe, I don't know, a gun or something like that. It's possible, but let's say there's a reduced likelihood of a single offender attempting that, and a reduced likelihood of such an attempt succeeding versus a similar attack on a single victim. So there is a working hypothesis that more than one person is involved in the crime, and the police are very interested in tracing and meeting the 2 men the girls were last seen with. As I've said, there are no witnesses to the actual dumping of the bodies. The killer or killers selected dumping sites for the bodies with very long lines of sight along the adjoining roads in both directions, where the headlights of an approaching car at night would be able to be seen minutes ahead of its arrival. But there was no shortage of potential witnesses to the Edinburgh side of the investigation, encompassing every person who was in the World's End that night, every person who was in every pub the young women had visited that night, because you never know, they might have noticed something suspicious or seen these men hanging around or anything. Every person who was wandering around the Royal Mile and may have witnessed the girls leaving with someone. You're talking potentially thousands of witnesses. And investigators undertook the enormous task of tracing and interviewing every single one that they could. From these witness statements, the facts of Jackie and Tony's story were confirmed. That the young women appeared to have first encountered these unknown men in the World's End. There was nothing to suggest that they knew them beforehand, and they had then spent a considerable amount of time in conversation with them. Oddly, no one in the pub seemed to be able to quite pinpoint when or in what circumstances Helen, Christine, and the 2 men had left, or even if they had all left together. Again, hindsight, obviously on the night itself, none of the other patrons had any reason to believe there was something special about the group. They didn't know what was to come. Why would they even look at them, you know? But it is still surprisingly rotten luck that out of everyone still in that pub when the group left, no one really seemed to have noticed them going. The closest to any kind of account for the girls leaving with the 2 men are the statements of 2 beat police officers who happened to be working on the Royal Mile on the evening of 15th of October 1977. They described witnessing 2 girls who may have matched the descriptions of Helen and Christine, not necessarily them, but may have matched their descriptions, walking away from the vicinity of the World's End pub around closing time, so likely around 11 p.m. An ordinary pub in Edinburgh without a club licence in 1979 would have closed around 11 p.m. Behind the 2 young women, seemingly hanging back, but not behaving in any way that drew particular suspicion from the officers at the time, were 2 males meeting the descriptions of the unknown men at the pub. The men were talking quietly among themselves, and then caught up to the 2 young women and started engaging them in conversation. This could well have been the moment the men made their move to lure the girls away, perhaps with, I don't know, the offer of a ride home, something like that. What also arose from the witness statements was a clear, consistent description of the 2 men and of the pub on the evening of the crimes, good enough to produce not only an artist's impression of the men, but of the pub itself on the night in question, like where exactly everyone had been located in the pub, their relative seating positions, etc. A really useful tool for jogging memories. This was then widely circulated in the local and national press.
It's funny how with kind of investigations into these things, I think we all sort of fancy ourselves detectives in some way, you know, maybe in a more romantic moments, but something like that, drawing up a picture, knowing where all these people are situated in the pub at that time, something like that seems as simple as that is something that maybe you wouldn't really think of piecing together.
Yeah, and actually,
you might think of like making sure you know who was there, but to actually know where they were.
Yeah.
It shows you that with detective work and investigations, things like that, there are just things that you, if you're not trained to think that way,
Yeah.
you probably wouldn't think about doing.
And I think the great value to that is in its ability to jog people's memories. It's not necessarily for the police's benefit. It's so that they can put that out in the newspapers and go, you were in the pub that night.
Yeah.
You would have been standing over here talking to Jimmy, you know, to your left and back, that table there. Oh, aye, now you mention it, I do remember people.
Yeah.
If you just get a description of somebody, yeah, I don't think I've seen them before. If people don't remember the details, it's almost like another way of putting the question to them. Okay, you don't remember someone matching this description, but do you remember that group that was sitting back and to your left? Oh, yeah, I remember that group. They cleared out about such and such a time. So that's the real benefit of that, and I think that's really clever. Obviously, before CCTV and everything like that, or, I mean, I think CCTV existed, but maybe only in, like, banks and stuff. And what emerged from this is it became very clear that no one in the pub, nor in any of the surrounding pubs, knew these guys. And this is another benefit of it because, you know, people maybe wouldn't necessarily go, I've never seen him before, because it's a pub, you know, like, you wouldn't necessarily be concerned with that. You'd just be like, there's a whole bunch of people here. But once they've interviewed all the people who'd been in the bar, and those people had all seen the artist's impression of how the bar was laid out and got a kind of idea of who was sitting where, they're able to piece together that no one in the pub was able to say, you know, oh yeah, that's Joey Jojo Junior Shabadoo. You know, none of the thousands of people interviewed said so much as, oh yeah, those guys, I don't know their names, but I've seen them around. Nothing like that. So without anyone actually having to come out and say it was strange, we'd never seen them before, because obviously it's a busy city pub, no one would ever think that, police were able to piece together the fact that these were not frequent visitors to the pubs of the Royal Mile. Probably more tellingly, as the media frenzy around the case spread awareness of that night's events to almost every man and woman in the land, no one came forward to say, oh aye, that was me, I'm one of the last people to see them alive. Why not? You know, that in itself seems to be indicative of these two guys having something to hide. Around this stage, police began to become more and more convinced that this wasn't some opportunistic outburst of violence, that this wasn't an unexpected jealous rage or moment of madness, that in fact two men had gone out that night, deliberately outside their normal haunts so that they would not be recognised, with an organised, agreed plan to abduct, rape and kill should the opportunity present itself. This was arrived at not only from the efficient, almost practiced seeming way in which the women were killed, but from the fact that on the busy streets around the Royal Mile at pub closing time on a Saturday, there's only one maybe sort of sighting of this group. There's no reports of any kind of fight or disturbance. There's no struggle that you'd expect to see with some kind of opportunistic kidnap. The pair were hypothesized to have been lured by persuasion and gone willingly with their killers, likely in a vehicle that the killers knew would be suitable for committing such a crime and controlling the victims and avoiding attention. Something like a works van or a camper van. In the book The World's End Murders, The Final Verdict, author Tom Wood, himself a retired detective from Lothian and Borders Police, who had some involvement in this case further down the line, writes, in all likelihood the perpetrators would have had a plan, certainly a rough idea of what they were going to do if they got the opportunity. One thing is striking, especially in the light of cases that came after this one. Other men seeking a victim to abduct, abuse and murder have a kit in their possession, rope for bindings and other paraphernalia. The World's End killer, or killers, got around the need to carry such items by using their victims' own clothing to suppress them. Their tights became bindings, their underwear gags. So within hours of the bodies being discovered, there were in effect two large-scale inquiries going on, as we've said. There was the East Lothian-based forensic examination of the discovery sites, and in Edinburgh, the huge investigation focusing on the World's End pub and the city centre. So, what of that forensic arm of the investigation? Now, of course, these women were brutally, horrifically raped before being murdered. As a result, samples of seminal fluid belonging to the attacker or attackers are able to be collected from the bodies. This is, of course, long before DNA profiling had been developed as an investigative tool. Police forensics were relatively limited compared to what they are today. They could identify whether or not the perpetrator was a blood antigen secretor. Most people secrete blood group antigens into their other bodily fluids. About 20% of people don't. In those who do, it's then possible to determine what blood group that person belongs to. They might also be able to tell if he's carrying certain diseases or whatever, if he's got like an unusual enzyme profile. This can all be used to exclude people if you have a suspect, but it's not like an ironclad identification. It doesn't help you pick an unknown culprit out of the population. But one of the first forensic scientists on the scene at both Christine and Helen's discovery sites is a man called Lester Knibb. K-N-I-B-B. That's your name of the month, Michael. Lester Knibb.
Lester Knibb. The Adventures of Lester Knibb.
I'd watch it. Lester Knibb, originally from South Africa, was educated in the West Indies, and at that time Lester was a young, forward-thinking scientist who took painstaking care in gathering, recording and preserving these samples to ensure that they would still be ready for testing at some unknown time in the future, when some then available technology might make it possible to pinpoint the originator of the sample. So he was already looking ahead at what we now know to be DNA profiling. And that was far from always the case prior to DNA actually coming in. If you take the Bible John case, for instance, where samples taken in the 60s were unusable later when a very likely suspect was put forth, which resulted in them not being able to convict or exclude that suspect from the crimes. Presumably, this is down to how samples are collected and stored, and that may well have been the difference here between the outcomes in the World's End murders versus the Bible John murders. Not to spoil anything, of course. Lester Knibb, by the way, was one of the few who would be involved in this case from its beginnings, down through the decades, to the bitter end. He very much appears to be one of the unsung heroes of this very bleak and prolonged episode in criminal history. One interesting piece of information that did come out of the forensic examination, very much an old school proper clue, almost Holmesian I think, related to the type of knots used to tie up the two victims. Christine had been bound with faultless and symmetrical reef knots, a type of expert knot used by sailors and fishermen, whereas Helen was bound with comparatively sloppy granny knots, the kind of knot you might use to tie your shoelaces. The circumstantial evidence for two killers continues to mount up. But time goes on. Initially there's a lot of confidence, there's a certain amount of evidence, there's a huge preponderance of witnesses, and many, many avenues for police to follow up on. But one by one, these avenues continue to prove fruitless. Some witnesses in the pub that night described the men as having unfashionably short hair for the time, so the cops sank countless hours into investigating members of the military garrison that was still in place at the time in Edinburgh Castle. Many of these soldiers had been reposted to different places around the world, so this avenue of inquiry took the investigation global, but ultimately it came to nothing. Known sex offenders in the Edinburgh area, in an era before the sex offenders register existed, it should be noted, were painstakingly tracked down, interviewed one by one, their whereabouts on the night having to be checked and double checked. The police dealt with leads put to them by fantasists, by malicious hoaxers, by well-meaning clairvoyants who all gave different conflicting accounts, by Walter Mitty wannabe detectives muddying the waters. They interviewed over 500 potential suspects, took 13,000 witness statements, amounting, in an era before computerization, to tens or hundreds of thousands of manual index cards. An immense amount of police time and resources were thrown at the task of finding justice for Helen and Christine, and yet the investigation stubbornly refused to yield a single really good suspect. In May 1978, 6 months after the murders took place, Lothian and Borders Police announced they were scaling down the investigation. Can you imagine how that must have felt for Helen's mother and father, for Christine's family, for Jacqueline and Tony and the other friends who'd been with the girls on the night of what they had no way of knowing was Helen and Christine's final night on Earth?
Yeah, it's like, pack up, lads.
Yeah.
There's no point. They've moved on.
Yeah. To have buried your family member, your daughter, your friend, and know that somewhere out there, someone, or more likely multiple people, are gloating over what they've done.
Yeah, it's like an unofficial acceptance that we're not going to catch these people, so they've got away with it.
Yeah,
that's
that wasn't
that's what you would feel.
What they said, but yeah, you're right. That's how people might take that.
That's how I would feel anyway. I would feel as if it was like an acknowledgement that the killers had got away with it and they were unlikely to be caught. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are limited resources.
Yeah,
for things.
And once you have no more leads, what do? You can't keep throwing bodies at something that. Yeah, it's a tough one, you know. But yeah, it can't have been easy. It can't have been easy for the families and everyone. It must have been just devastating. It was in the years that followed, the unsolved years, you might want to call it, that the case, with its sheer nastiness, with its complete lack of resolution, really embedded itself in the sort of local psyche and mythology. It would pop up in the news again every couple of years, a new statement by the police, because they never really closed the investigation. They just scaled it down. They just realised we don't have leads for hundreds of officers to be following up. They just scaled it down. So they were still working away at this and that, but every so often there'd be a statement by the police. There'd be some new minor detail might come up, or a new suspect would have to be considered and eliminated. So that trickle kept it in the consciousness, but it never really led anywhere. Again, it didn't close down, but it was at a standstill, or at best it was going round in circles. It was almost a decade before there was any further substantial movement. It was in the mid to late 1980s that DNA forensics began to emerge as a useful investigative tool. In 1987, Colin Pitchfork, an English rapist and double murderer, became the first person in the world to be convicted of a major crime thanks to DNA profiling. Colin Pitchfork, by the way, recently was approved for parole, although I think it's now gone to the Home Office and they're trying to stop it happening or something like that, but that's a whole other case.
Is that the one that was in the news recently?
Yeah, that's him, yeah.
I know the last couple of days, yeah.
Yeah, he was the first to be... It was actually his confessions that got him convicted, but it was the DNA evidence that cracked him, if that makes sense. When they brought the DNA evidence to the table and said, look, there's like a 1 in a billion chance it was someone else, then he kind of folded and started to confess to the crime. Mm. But Lester Knibb, who is still involved in the World's End case through its dormant years, was following advances in this area with a keen interest. Of course he is, obviously, it's his business, but specifically with regard to the World's End murder, he's acutely aware that that is going to be the thing. If anything solves this case at this late stage, it's likely to come down to those samples taken from the bodies of Helen and Christine, and any scientific advances that would allow them to extract more information on the killer or killers from those samples. So, in April of 1989, a year and a half after Colin Pitchfork's conviction, Lester travels down to Chorley, I believe it was, to the labs of a company called Cellmark with Christine's coat, which, if you remember, had been found on Helen's body. Cellmark was a very early leader. It's still going today, but it was a very early leader in the field of DNA profiling. However, because the samples were over a decade old at this point, and because the technology and the tools themselves were at such an embryonic stage of development, the ability to reliably piece together a usable profile from even a partially degraded sample just wasn't there yet. They weren't able to give a meaningful genetic profile of the killer. However, the exercise didn't prove completely useless. Enough markers were identified in the sample to clear the names of at least 2 potential suspects at the time. So Knibb had the remaining samples stored at a special facility operated by Cellmark, which offered a more stable and preservative environment than anywhere Lothian and Borders Police had access to. The idea being that as the DNA extraction process is refined and improved over the years ahead, they can return to these stains and finally get a full profile. And as the 80s became the 90s, DNA forensics continued to progress, which is fantastic, but this put the kind of skeleton crew of investigators still looking at the case in something of a quandary. As the technology improved, the chances of getting a usable profile increased, but the extraction processes of the era remained highly destructive, meaning a large proportion of a physical sample is taken and destroyed in the process of getting a profile. So if they jump the gun and they retest the sample every time a small successive improvement is made in the technology, they're going to burn through, kind of literally burn through all the samples they have and be left with no evidence, nothing left for future forensics if they can't quite get anything from them. So on the one hand, it's like it's a waiting game. They want to wait until the science has had a good amount of advancement before they take the chance on another test. They want to be reasonably sure they're almost certainly going to get a proper sample this time. But on the other hand, every day they wait could well be a day that a psychopathic killer or killers are out there on the streets planning, doing God knows what. So it's a tricky situation. In 1997, we're now 20 years since the murders. 20 years the family and friends of Helen and Christine have been without justice, without answers. A decision was taken to hand the investigation over to a specialist cold case unit within Strathclyde Police. Strathclyde Police was a larger neighbouring police force that covered the western half of the Central Belt, covering Glasgow and Clyde and Ayrshire and Argyll.
I miss everything being Strathclyde, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Like, as a kid growing up in Glasgow, everything
Same,
was
yeah.
Strathclyde. Strathclyde buses.
Yeah,
For some reason,
yeah.
that's what I keep thinking of.
Like the school jotters had the Strathclyde Council
Yeah.
logo on them. I remember it very well. But this was, Strathclyde Police was the police force that covered Glasgow and Clyde and all these areas before all the different forces were then amalgamated into the single national force that we have today, Police Scotland. So they're thinking, perhaps a shake-up is what this case needs. Different people, fresh eyes, fresh approaches. By this time, the destructiveness of DNA testing was beginning to be ironed out somewhat, and they felt that with some additional resources, the case may now be in a position to be solved. The cold case investigators scoured the old Lothian and Borders records to identify every man known to have been in the World's End that night, of course, with the notable exception of the two unknown males seen speaking to Helen and Christine, who had never come forward or been traced, as well as various other suspects and persons of interest from across the investigation. They traced and swabbed every single one of them. All in all, over 500 samples were taken. The sperm traces on the coat were finally retested and at last yielded a complete profile. This profile was tested against all of the 500 samples, and none of them matched. Not one of them. Not great, but there's a silver lining. That's 500 innocent men cleared of a horrendous crime that's been hanging over their heads for, one way or another for God knows how long. Interestingly though, the testing at this time yielded the profile of only one unknown man. Given all the circumstantial evidence pointing to two offenders, the knots and everything else, I think there was some expectation of picking up two profiles, but no. Now, I'm going to make a short detour to another case here. It is relevant and you'll see why in a minute. On the 21st of September 2001, the torso of an unknown, approximately 6-year-old boy was discovered in the River Thames in London. The boy, given the name Adam by police, had been poisoned, had had his throat slit, his body deliberately drained of blood, and he had been dismembered by someone well practiced in anatomical dissection. Mineral testing on Adam's bones indicated that he only arrived in the UK a matter of days before his murder, and that he was likely born somewhere near Benin City in Nigeria. Metropolitan Police believed Adam had been trafficked into England specifically for the purpose of being a muti ritual killing. Muti is a form of traditional medicine practiced in parts of southern Africa usually pretty innocuous. The use of plants and animal parts, pretty typical stuff. But Muti also ascribes certain properties to certain parts of the human anatomy. And there are a subset of Muti practitioners in Africa, I'm sure a very small subset, who have been known to engage in body snatching, the desecration of corpses, and even, sadly, the murder and dismemberment of children in order to obtain body parts for ritual medicine. I don't want to delve too deeply into this. It's a horrific and just heartbreaking unsolved case, definitely worthy of its own episode, but the reason it's relevant to the case of the World's End murders lies in the methods used to try and trace the unknown boy's parents. An ancestral or familial DNA process, one that relies upon the fact that the Y chromosome in men, barring occasional mutations, passes unchanged from father to son, and is therefore also almost always shared by brothers and patrilineal uncles. The use of these techniques by the Metropolitan Police to trace wee Adam's relatives and the media coverage of this, though it would sadly prove fruitless in Adam's case, drew the attention of Lester Knibb and the Scottish officers working on the World's End case. They have these samples. The profile they've extracted from the samples doesn't match any of the previous suspects. It's now been run through the National DNA database and turned up no matches. What else can they do short of swabbing every single man in Edinburgh or Scotland even? And they don't have the resources or the powers to do anything even remotely approaching that. But what if they could test a voluntary cross-section of the male population of the Scottish Central Belt, not on suspicion of being the perpetrator, but checking for anyone who may be related to the perpetrator? They don't have to randomly chance upon the killer in the process of carrying out these samples. Killer, doubtless, would try to avoid being tested anyway. They only have to chance upon maybe a son or a cousin or an uncle of the killer, some unwitting relative who doesn't know he's related to the World's End murderer. Discovering a close match would then allow them to at least narrow down the search to a family line. So they send off part of the original sample again to have the Y chromosome isolated and profiled, and they wait. Around about this time, the murders were the subject of a reconstruction on the BBC One television programme Crimewatch, broadcast on 8th of October 2003. I'm sure you remember Crimewatch, Michael.
Oh yeah, they used to always have these like photo fits and things like that. I always particularly remember one episode of Crimewatch, and it was because I think sometimes they showed things that had been solved. I just remember a thing about a guy who murdered his wife, and then he took a Stanley knife across his cheek and down under his chin and then right along, so to try to fake being stabbed. And they showed a reenactment of this, and I just remember it being absolutely horrific. Are you alright? Did you faint?
No. That comes through really loud when I do that. It's only a tiny little, like a USB stick, you know, the cover for the metal tip.
Yeah. And
I'm dropping it way up at the opposite end of the table. It's really quiet to me, but on the waveform, because the vibrations are coming through the table,
it's really loud.
So Crimewatch was, as you say, like a monthly show that featured reconstructions of unsolved crimes in order to find witnesses and elicit tips from the public to help solve the cases. And I think they did sometimes do recaps on cases that had been solved as a result of a previous reconstruction. The show ended in 2017, but I remember this programme growing up. This was it was a huge TV fixture, you know.
Yeah. You're saying it was monthly, and that blows my mind, because in my mind it was like done twice a week. You know, like. Yeah,
it's also notable for the fact that one of its main presenters was herself brutally murdered on her doorstep, but that's yet another case for yet another episode.
Yeah, that's a terrible, terrible case.
Jill Dando.
Yeah.
Amazingly, I think anyway, given nearly 40 years had gone by, the reenactments on Crimewatch seem to have jogged some memories and brought forward a number of previously unknown, credible witnesses, including, crucially, at long last, witnesses in the East Lothian area, including a man who had been walking at night by Gosford Bay and seen a suspicious van driving erratically in the vicinity of where Christine Eadie had been dumped.
Why didn't he come forward before?
I mean, I think he didn't know it was of any relevance, right?
Right.
And this is the thing. He just remembered having seen a van driving erratically, and I think maybe he just didn't think about it, or never really hadn't really followed the case or anything like that. But one thing that seemed to help a lot of witnesses place things they'd seen long previously as being things that happened on the night of the murder was the fact that it was the day Bing Crosby's death had been in the news.
Wow.
I mean, I think that's interesting because I certainly couldn't tell you what I was doing on the day like Amy Winehouse died, you know, but I don't know, I guess Scotland has a lot of really big Bing Crosby fans of a certain generation,
There's just
don't they?
two things about Bing Crosby that always spring to mind. One is Little Drummer Boy, where he collaborated with David Bowie, and that's where that came from.
Yeah.
Peace on earth. Sorry. And the other is the story that we don't know if it was absolutely true, but one of his children said that he used to beat them with, was it like a sack full of oranges or something like that?
God.
I'm sure that was the... Hold on, let me just...
Why don't you Bing it, Michael?
No, but... No, I'll Google it. Oh, I've just got one thing here that says, today I learned Bing Crosby beat his children, calling one satchel ass, bucket butt, and my fat-assed kid.
What a fucking weirdo.
Well, he sounds like an arsehole. And the thing is...
He does, doesn't he?
You know, I think one of his sons, or maybe two of his sons, claimed that he'd been
not a nice guy.
Overly aggressive, but then I think one of the other brothers maybe says that nah, that's rubbish. So you never know. But I just,
there you go. I'm glad that's resolved.
I know. Another case closed, everybody. If only we had a detective theme tune that would play at the end of that.
Get Bing Crosby to do it.
Talking to Dawn.
Yeah. I think there definitely is a certain generation of Scottish person that's right into Bing Crosby. I can just kind of hear, you know,
oh, yeah.
You remember, Jimmy, it was the night Bing Crosby died.
Yeah.
Oh, aye, Netta, I'll no forget it. You know, like, people right into Bing.
Nothing worse than a Scotsman mocking other Scottish people's accents, Martin.
Love it. But then, after all that, came a completely unexpected bombshell discovery.
Bob Hope.
So remember that sample of body fluids that went away to have its Y chromosome sequenced? A sample which, along with all the others, had previously been tested and yielded only DNA from Christine or Helen and this one unknown male. Well, when that sample was processed by the lab to isolate the Y chromosome, which is only found in biological males, two distinct Y chromosome profiles emerged. The lack of a second male sample had always been one of the biggest head scratchers for the investigation. There had been so much to suggest two men had been involved, eyewitnesses at the world's end, the two different knots used, the practicalities of abducting and subduing two pretty much adult victims, yet somehow they'd found nothing forensically on a second man until now. That extra Y chromosome was the big red flag that drew their attention to the profile of a second man that had been hiding in the samples all along. One of the two men, perhaps for some biological reason, perhaps out of sheer chance, had left a much stronger imprint that had drowned out, if you like, the fainter trace of the second man in the earlier, less advanced, less sensitive testing. Painstakingly, forensic scientists used cutting-edge techniques to isolate the second, weaker profile from the stronger one. As it happens, investigators would never end up carrying out their carefully crafted plan to test a cross-section of the Scottish population for familial links to the samples. There would be no more need for cross-referencing, no need for complex tracing of familial lines. When they fed that second, previously hidden profile into the National DNA Database in 2004, it threw up a hit. One single hit for the man who left it there. A violent sex offender by the name of Angus Robertson Sinclair. On the 25th of November 2004, Sinclair, who was already in prison for a series of other offences, we'll talk about who Sinclair was and his previous activities in part 2 of this podcast, but those details, his background, were deliberately not made available to the jury at his trial. I think they were generally glossed over by the press as well at the time. There may have been an injunction out against reporting on it to avoid prejudicing the case and running the chance of a mistrial. Not sure, but I know that's been done in other cases. This seemed to follow that pattern. Just know for now that Sinclair was a bad man, and he was already locked up. Investigators visit Sinclair in prison and further detain him under the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act, forcing him to have DNA swabs taken to confirm his identification. Around this time, police are also looking into the identity of the other man, the one with the stronger DNA profile, the one they'd been looking for years, who hadn't appeared on the DNA database in all those years of searching. Upon looking closely into Sinclair's friends and acquaintances, they hit upon Gordon Hamilton, the brother of Sinclair's then wife in the 1970s, Sinclair's brother-in-law, essentially. Unfortunately, Hamilton had died of a heart attack in Glasgow Royal Infirmary in 1997, aged just 41. Witnesses indicated that Hamilton and Sinclair had had a massive falling out in 1978, and later Hamilton had spiralled into alcoholism and homelessness in his late 30s, perhaps leading to his untimely death. There would be no opportunity to bring Gordon Hamilton to justice for his very likely part in the crimes, but Hamilton's death would come to haunt the trial in a number of other ways. So okay, they've got this Sinclair creep. His DNA is found on and in and all over these poor murdered women. He and Hamilton match the artist's impressions pieced together from dozens of witnesses at the world's end. He'd got previous for exactly these kinds of crimes, although crucially, as I've said, that fact would not be allowed at trial. He owned a van, a camper van, that matched the descriptions from the Gosford Bay disposal site. The van had upholstery inside that appeared to match fibres found on the bodies. The van itself had long since been destroyed, but the investigators went to the lengths of tracking down an unaltered, period-accurate Toyota Hiace and testing the upholstery, and it matched the fibres exactly. Now, fibre analysis is not particularly strong evidence, as we know, but you have all of this circumstantial evidence, and you have the rock-solid DNA evidence linking him to the girls. Surely it's a slam dunk. Get him to trial, get him convicted, and let's get some small measure of peace and justice and resolution for the families and friends of Christine and Helen. On the 27th of August 2007, the trial of Angus Sinclair went underway at the Edinburgh High Court. The BBC news site at the time said of the indictment, Mr. Sinclair is accused of acting alongside his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, who is now dead, of persuading or compelling the girls into a motor vehicle and holding them against their will. He is alleged to have driven Miss Eadie to Gosford Bay, Aberlady, and there or elsewhere she was attacked, stripped and gagged with her underwear. He is accused of tying her wrists and neck, raping her and killing her by restricting her breathing. Mr. Sinclair is accused of raping and murdering Miss Scott in the same way and driving her to a road near Haddington, in a field there or elsewhere in Edinburgh and East Lothian, and attacking her. At the start of the trial last Monday, Lord Clark told the jury that Mr. Sinclair was going to issue a special defence that any sexual contact with the girls was consensual. The judge also told jurors the accused may put forward evidence blaming his late brother-in-law for any wrongdoing. Those last two lines describe exactly what then followed. Defence QC Edgar Preus, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his surname, I think it's Preus, lodged a submission that the prosecution had failed to show that Sinclair had acted with violence towards the victims. Sinclair claimed that yes, he had had sex with the girls, hence why his DNA was found on the bodies and on their clothes, but it had been consensual. Bearing in mind, of course, the age of consent in Scotland is 16, so as creepy and gross as a man in his 30s having sex with a 17-year-old is, while that absolutely would not be considered socially acceptable by most reasonable people in Scotland, it's not legally a crime. He contended that any harm that came to the girls was perpetrated by the conveniently long dead Gordon Hamilton without Sinclair's knowledge. Mr. Price said, "There is no evidence this had to be a two-man job. The evidence is consistent with it being perpetrated by one person, and if it is one person, there is no way a jury can be asked to adjudicate." And then, this is an important statement. Let's say there was evidence of DNA on a ligature. If there was DNA from two accused or from Sinclair, that would be a different cup of tea, but there is absolutely nothing. If there had been DNA on a ligature, something of that nature, I don't think I could stand here. So essentially what he's saying is, the semen traces on the body and coat prove only that Sinclair had sexual contact with the young women. It does not prove he killed them. And there are no traces of any kind linking Sinclair to any of the bindings or anything like that would solidly establish he had a hand in the violence applied to the women. And in fact, in a strict legal sense, Price was right. The involvement of Hamilton, the lack of evidence strongly tying Sinclair to these tools of coercion, like the ligatures, left a hole in the case against him. The judge, John Clark, considered this submission and then announced, "I have reached the conclusion that the submissions made by the senior counsel for the accused are sound and have not been adequately rebutted by the Crown. I am of the view that the evidence taken at its highest in the context of both the evidence as a whole and evidence that does not exist is neutral." So in other words, it doesn't prove anything either way. As far as the murders themselves were concerned, there is no forensic evidence linking the accused to items used to kill the girls. The question for the court is rather whether there is sufficient in law for the jury to infer safely and beyond reasonable doubt that the accused was involved in any or all of the crimes libelled. So Lord Clark determined that the decision could not be left to a jury, and he pronounced that the accused had no case to answer, and formally acquitted Angus Robertson Sinclair on the 10th of September 2007.
Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, it's completely logical, but it doesn't sit well, does it?
No, it doesn't at all. Following the collapse of the trial, though, it was finally revealed to the public, or at least to the vast majority of the public who got their information on the case from the press, those who hadn't done their own extensive research into Sinclair. Maybe if they'd gone through old newspaper clippings from decades back, they would have known this, but Angus Sinclair, as it turns out, was already a twice convicted killer and prolific serial rapist. A man who had been committing sex attacks since boyhood, who slayed his first victim at the age of 16. Now, this is not the end of the story, far from it, but I think we'll end the first part of the podcast there and reconvene next month when we'll take a close look at the appalling and tragic crimes of Angus Sinclair before and after the World's End murders. His background, his twisted friendship with Gordon Hamilton, some of the many mysterious and unsolved cases thought to be linked to the pair, and the aftermath to this trial, which would go on to change the course of the Scottish criminal justice system forever.
So a nice upbeat episode to look forward to.
Yeah.
It's a strange one. I think it was interesting when you were talking about the two different police departments.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of a trope from cop procedural movies and things like that, where you have different...
In America, yeah.
And you don't really... Because Scotland's such a small country in comparison, you don't really think about that happening, but it obviously did happen.
Mostly because police in the UK in general are much more sort of nationalised than it is in the US. In the US, police departments are almost like ruled over by a local sheriff and a local DA who are, in a sense, they're kind of politicians. Yeah. Whereas...
Because sheriffs are elected, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And so are DAs. DAs are elected as well. Whereas in the UK, they don't have this kind of... they did in this case, but we'll come back to that. But they tend not to have quite so much of this is my own little empire. I'm pals with the DA and that kind of thing. It tends to be much more top-down, centralised, especially now because in Scotland we have a fully nationalised single police force.
And I know, funnily enough, I won't name the person obviously, but I've got a friend who's a police sergeant, a big supporter of the current Scottish government, but very much says that they've absolutely messed up the way that policing's done, that it actually was better when it was regionalised.
that may well be true, but at the same time, the centralisation of it means that there's less of the sort of things that you maybe see in, and I'm not saying they don't happen, but less of some of the things that you maybe see happening in places where you've got sort of particular forces that have really high rates of maybe things like alleged corruption and things where there's little sort of closed ranks departments. In a sense, I can see the logic to opening it up to be national, because yes, it becomes this big impersonal machine, but by being this big impersonal machine, it perhaps, I don't really know, but at least in theory would help root out the kind of individual prejudice and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't really know enough about it. It's always been striking to me that my friend has been so vocal to me about how problematic it is when he's such a big supporter of everything else that the government does. But anyway, so the other thing that struck me about this case was the fact that it had shades of what happened in the Monster of the Andes case, you know, where you have this, it feels almost like a legal loophole. It's not a loophole, it's a logical defence, because he very well could have been innocent. And if it's a 50-50 shot, 50-50's reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Easily reasonable doubt, even though he probably was involved. Did he actually commit the murders or not? But I find these sorts of cases really frightening, just because often what happens is that someone makes a fairly innocuous decision. And I'm not putting the blame on them at all. I just mean that, you know, someone strikes up a conversation in a bar, and then they decide, oh, we're having a nice time. And that's all. They're just there to have a nice time, forget their worries, and then all of a sudden, little do they know, they've crossed paths with pure evil.
Yeah.
And I think that's the fact that the girls were most probably, almost definitively, persuaded to probably get into the van.
Yeah. Everyone seemed to be getting on pretty well, and you know, it wasn't like,
It seems likely that it's, I mean, you said that one of the theories was that this was a couple of people who deliberately went out of their usual places because they wouldn't be identified.
Yeah, they set out to do it.
Some people have what we would call the gift of the gab. You know, some people have the ability to speak well and to have influence in people. And unfortunately, every now and then you have someone who's a raging psychopath who has that ability, which always fascinates me, because psychopaths notoriously have problems processing empathy. And part of being persuasive is often being able to anticipate, you know, they measure EQ, emotional intelligence in people, and how that's often related to how well people can negotiate situations with people, often verbally.
Yeah. So
it's fascinating that someone who you would assume is psychopathic, you would hope is psychopathic. I think it's almost more terrifying to think that someone who actually experiences empathy
could do that.
Would do these things. But you know, the fact that they can still be so persuasive. There have been a couple of times in my life, I think I've probably mentioned this, where I've met people who, I mean, I don't need to have them evaluated. I know they're psychopathic, and I would never want to dehumanize someone, but in those instances, sometimes it at least feels like you're almost dealing with a different species.
Yeah.
You're almost dealing with something that's just not, I say I don't want to dehumanize it, and then I'm saying they're not human, but the parts of us that we value the most as human, kindness, tolerance, empathy, all of these things are missing.
Yeah. I guess the unfortunate thing is, like, the parts of being human that we value the most are not always the most representative values in what humans actually exhibit. Does that make sense? That's part of the unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean,
what we aspire to is very often not what we are, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a bit more hopeful. I often think that we were talking about this the other day when we went to shoot that video for Patreon. We talked about the fact that some people, probably quite a lot of people, they follow the rules, but if the rules weren't there and the consequences weren't there, that they would be a very different animal.
Yeah.
But I also kind of have a belief, and maybe it's more of a hope, that people are inherently good for the most part, and that maybe society would collapse if they weren't. But I can totally see both arguments. Getting back to the case, it's always terrifying to me that you can just cross paths with someone.
The sheer chance nature of it is really frightening, that there was nothing really that they were...
Picking that pub.
Yeah.
Talking to someone. Maybe...
just catching their eye in some way.
Yeah.
Sheer chance.
That's what I mean, what they actually do is the most horrifying thing, but that is something that frightens me. Because sometimes, maybe you have these morbid thoughts, I don't know, but sometimes when I'm in areas where there are a lot of people like that sitting in a pub, you don't know who you're sitting next to. You know, I know someone who is a really nice guy, but he always stands up to people, and he's got a great sense of morality, but he stands up to people in an aggressive way, I think, sometimes. And he doesn't have experience of bad things happening when you do that sometimes. And I've tried to say to him before,
that's going to backfire on you one day. Yeah.
You don't know who you're crossing sometimes. I'm not saying don't stand up for the things you believe in, but just be wary, you know. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Good night, everyone.
I think the other thing as well about this case, the question of whether or not to allow mention of previous crimes before a trial, it ultimately didn't matter in this case because it ended up going to the judge to make the call, not the jury. But
that's a hard one.
Yeah, because like on the surface, it seems like they should allow that because how a person has acted in the past is arguably like a form of evidence if you can show a pattern of behaviour.
They're allowed to use it for sentencing, you know, for like character.
Right, yeah, sure.
So if you're found guilty of something and you've never done anything before, then...
Well, on the other hand, I guess like the reason that they don't is like if someone's done something before, that might make them more likely to be on the police radar for future crimes. Like I guess we don't want a situation where the police are just unloading all their unsolved crimes onto one guy who did something once before, put that to trial, and then when we say he killed someone before, the jury's going to be, oh yeah, definitely, you know, no doubt.
It's kind of a little bit like, and I'm sure we'll maybe talk about it at some point, but you know, the Steve Avery case.
Oh yeah.
You know, where for people that haven't watched it, you know, there's a series called Making a Murderer. It's probably, for a while, it was like the most famous true crime series.
I'd be surprised if there's a great many people listening to this who haven't, but if you haven't, do check it out.
But the thing with that case is there's a lot of stuff that is left out by the documentarians, and there's some things that are really dark and quite frightening about.
And quite damning. Both ways, actually.
Yeah. And you might actually have so there was a situation in that where he was he went to jail for something that he didn't do.
Yeah.
But when you start hearing some of the things that he might have done, I mean, we don't know 100%.
Sure.
There's the feeling, and I'm not justifying it, but there was a feeling that police framed him or just assumed immediately that he had done this thing because they knew.
Well, that was definitely the thesis of the show.
Yeah. That
was what the show was putting across. But then I think if you read into the case, there's like not things that throw that into doubt actually, but more just things that make it maybe look a bit more like he did do it. But the funny thing is, could well be a situation of he did do it and the police framed him. You know, like just a complete chance alignment they were desperate to catch him for it and he maybe did do it. Who knows?
Because that's what people said was that the main issue was, did he get a fair trial, not whether he done it or not. You know, and I'm sure that's not what the family think, the family of the poor murdered woman. But anyway, so the idea of bringing in someone's history, I think in an emotive sense, it feels like it should be brought in. However, you could be a serial killer and you could be brought to trial for another murder that you didn't do. It's possible that happens. And
then the issue is someone else is out there who did it and is getting off with it because the fact of your previous has blinded the jury a little bit. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Quick reminder of the Patreon for anyone that wants to help us out. Patreon.com/Talking Till Dawn. Once again, that's not the only way to support us. You don't have to spend a penny. Recommend the show to a friend. Share us on social media. Write us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to us on the Talking Till Dawn YouTube channel or say hello on Twitter. Shout out to Big Jerk, Stepan Demshishin, Christina Barton, and the guys on the Fit's Been Happening podcast, and everyone else who's given us a tweet or a retweet or helped promote us in any way. You guys are the best.
Just wanted to thank everyone who's been leaving reviews on the podcast, on your app of choice. It really helps the show. But it was just to say that I use an app called Podcast Addict, and you don't really see those reviews in with the iTunes ones and all that. So
okay.
Anyway, so I just wanted to thank Torso Squirrel for the lovely review that they left there. So thank you very much.
Cool. Anyway, Mike, I think for now, the sun might be coming up.
The sun is coming up. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Does good night make sense? Is it morning?
Shit.
Sleepy time, everyone. Night night.
You've got work in a minute.
Morning,
Away to
morning.
work.
I know.